I will now introduce the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs gives practical wisdom for young people. First of all, the question of authorship. Who wrote the book of Proverbs? Well, the obvious answer would be Solomon, and indeed he would be the main author of the book. It says in 1 Kings 4 verse 32 that Solomon knew some 3,000 proverbs. The book of Proverbs only has 915 verses, so he actually knew more proverbs than are recorded in the book of Proverbs. He collected some from all the foreigners with whom he had contact. But there are other authors that are identified in the book of Proverbs. In chapter 31 and verse 1, it indicates that those proverbs are to be associated with King Lemuel. And King Lemuel appears to be a non-Israelite king. There is no King Lemuel, and Jewish tradition that has sometimes tried to identify Lemuel with Solomon does not seem to be justified. In fact, he was king of Massa. Massa is a Ishmaelite tribe, and so he may be a Ishmaelite. That is a descendant of Abraham's union with his slave woman Hagar. Agur is another author that is mentioned, and whoever Agur is, he is not Solomon. He looks like he's probably Israelite. It also mentions Hezekiah's men being involved in the editing of the book. Proverbs 25:1 it says, "These also are Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah king of Judah copied." Now, Hezekiah was king of Judah in the 700s BC, the late 700s BC, which would be a couple of centuries after the time of Solomon. And so this means that the book was edited over the course of at least a couple of centuries, as Hezekiah's men were involved in that. And then there's a couple of statements about the words of the wise. It says, "Pay attention and listen to the sayings of the wise," in chapter 22, verse 17. Chapter 24, verse 23, "These also are sayings of the wise." Though there are the Proverbs of Solomon, but then there are the sayings of the wise. Now, this particular section, 22:17 through 24:33, has a number of parallels with an Egyptian wisdom writer by the name of Amenemopet. And it raises the question, well, what's the relationship between this portion of Proverbs and the sayings of Amenemopet? Amenemopet dates to around 1000 BC, though there is some uncertainty as to a precise dating. It may be that Solomon collected some of these proverbs from Egyptian sources. That is, we know he was married to an Egyptian wife, and in his trade relations and contacts with Egyptians, he may have collected their wise sayings and incorporated it among the ones which he kept track of. In other words, I don't think it can be ruled out that Solomon has basically borrowed some pagan sayings into his Proverbs, and why not? After all truth is God's truth. And so if an Egyptian sage happened to say something that was true, then why shouldn't he and God through him incorporate that into the scriptural book of Proverbs? outline of the book. It begins with a preamble that gives the purpose of the book. It continues with a kind of a pep talk, a discourse on wisdom through chapter 9. And then Solomonic Proverbs in chapter 10 through 22:16. Then the sayings of the wise, 22:17 through 24:34. And then more Solomonic Proverbs, 25:1, the ones edited by Hezekiah's men through chapter 29. Then the sayings of Agur. Then the sayings of Lemuel, that he heard from his mother. So we could call this the sayings of King Lemuel's mother. And also an acrostic poem on the virtuous woman concludes the book. It's 22 verses corresponding to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, talking about the virtuous woman. Let's start with the first section on the purpose of Proverbs. It's for attaining wisdom and discipline, for understanding and words of insight, for acquiring a disciplined and prudent life, doing what is right, just, and fair, for the giving of prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get their guidance. For understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. One of the points here is that the Proverbs are especially for younger people. It refers to the young in verse 4, chapter 1 and verse 4. Though even older persons, the wise, can learn and increase their knowledge. And this explains a lot of the father-son type language in the book. Listen to my son, to your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Think of the young, though, more as adolescents rather than small children. Hence the stress in some points on sexual temptations. One of the purposes was for acquiring a disciplined and prudent life, and many areas of prudent advice are given in the area of the ideal wife or person, child rearing, friendship, relations with the unwise or the ungodly, how to handle money, how to handle sexual temptation, and so on and so forth. You might say that the wisdom of Proverbs represents the law applied practically in ordinary daily life. Like the law, Proverbs promises a long life. In the Ten Commandments, honor your father and mother so that you may live long in the land. So with Proverbs, do not forget my commands, keep them in your heart, for they will prolong your life many years. You might say that Proverbs teaches us religion outside the church. What do you do when you're not worshiping on Sunday, or for Israel it would be the Sabbath? Well, these are the sorts of things you do to express your religious faith in more secular contexts. Now, perhaps one of the most useful ways to study Proverbs is to pick some topics, use the concordance and find out everything about that topic in Proverbs, and then put it all together into a coherent whole. And we'll do that with a few topics. What is wisdom? Subject study. Well, there's two prongs to the meaning of wisdom. One prong is skillfulness. The Hebrew word hakam, that's H with a dot under it, or in some transliteration systems CH, means to be skillful. It's used in Exodus 35, 31 through 35 of craftsmen who were skillful at doing their crafts. In Psalm 107, it is used of the skill of a sailor in navigating rough seas. I'll look at the verse in Psalm 107. The sailors reeled and staggered like drunken men. They were at their wits' end, is how the NIV translated it. But at their wits' end is literally all their wisdom, their chokmah, was compounded. And so wisdom is a very practical thing. Here's the skill of a sailor in ruddering a ship through stormy seas. Wisdom generally is skillfulness at living. Similar imagery is used in Proverbs 1:5. Let the discerning get guidance. The word translated guidance there, the Hebrew word is takbulot, means literally steering, as in steering a boat. Wisdom is a skill of steering or navigating through life. It's not intelligence, but skillfulness in living. Having an high IQ is no guarantee of wisdom. Wisdom is practical and not theoretical. Philosophers and intellectuals and theorists are not necessarily wise in the biblical sense. They can make a mess of their marriages and of their lives, even though they have great intelligence and academic attainment. Wisdom means living in harmony with God's order in the universe and therefore being successful at life. So one aspect of wisdom is skillfulness at living. Another aspect of wisdom is godliness. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, it says in Proverbs 9:10. And the Lord is the source of wisdom. The Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. And so biblical wisdom has a religious element. Now, this is not true of Egyptian wisdom. It was entirely secular. But biblical wisdom makes fear of the Lord, or godliness, a first principle of wisdom. And again, extra-biblical ancient wisdom literature from Egypt was very secular. The gods play little, if any, role in it. While we're on the topic of wisdom, we should say something about a character that shows up in Proverbs, Lady Wisdom. Lady Wisdom in Proverbs 1 and verse 8 and 9, chapters 8 and 9, is basically wisdom personified as a lady who calls on fools to come and to learn from her. She is sometimes called a hypostasis, that is a substance or essential attribute of God himself that's been personified. She shows up in Proverbs 8. You might pause and read this, but here it shows that she helped God create the world. Now, some take that passage in Proverbs 8 as messianic. If you go back to it, the Lord brought me forth as the first of his works before his deeds of old. And some have said, oh, well, this is a prophecy of Christ, because Christ, like wisdom here, assisted God in creation. The Arians in church history actually argued from Proverbs 8:22 that Christ was a created being. But then you could ask the question, when did God not have wisdom? And so it's not quite a messianic prophecy, and yet Christ is the real embodiment of wisdom and thus shares some of the characteristics of Lady Wisdom. We'll move on to fear of the Lord in the next video.